I hope you enjoyed the food, and I'm here to introduce Phil Ackermain-Leist. I always pronounce that wrong. I think I got it right this time. He's an associate professor of environmental studies and director of the Green Mountain College Masters in Sustainable Food Systems program. He is also director of the Farm and Food Project at Green Mountain College, and he's the one that had to answer many of the calls about the 2 oxen that Chuck Ross mentioned earlier. He got a lesson in international email campaigns against the decision that the school made. He's also co-owner of Uptucket Farm and Homestead in Pollitt, Vermont since 1997, and the subject of his first book. He's also author of Rebuilding the Food Shed, How to Create Local, Sustainable, and Secure Food Systems, published by Chelsea Green in 2013. And with that, Phil, you are the moderator for this panel, and I thank you coming up from Green Mountain College and participating.
Great. Thanks so much.
Great.
Well, thanks so much, Doug. And if UVM had known, I never do anything in moderation, so we'll see if we do this okay or not here. So this session that we have here represents 3 of the things that I really do most appreciate about UVM. First of which is the degree to which UVM collaborates with other institutions of higher ed. This is a fairly unusual scenario that we have in front of us here. I also appreciate the transdisciplinary approach to problem solving in a land-grant institution, something that needs to happen more often in more places. And then also the breaking down of what may never, or at least should have never existed, that is the divide between academics and practitioners. So we're very lucky to be here, very privileged to be a part of everything that's happening here today, and I think part of what you're sampling is what needs to happen in more places in the country. So hats off to UVM and all the great work here that's come together. So the theme of this panel is biophysical constraints, a good academic word. It's been framed eloquently and with detail and even with the other side of the coin thinking by Rosamund Naylor in her excellent keynote. And the panel's task here before us is to portray how we can transform biophysical constraints, not just into opportunities, but hopefully the right opportunities. So we can think of biophysical constraints not simply as limiting factors, but also as limiting factors that become points of necessary resistance and traction for the good hard thinking that we all need to do. And one of the points I think that will come out here in this session is that just any solution is not necessarily a good solution when it comes to biophysical constraints. And so I thought I'd offer you a quick story here about biophysical constraints and a good example of trying the right thing. So my friend Oscar down in North Carolina that I worked with years ago had the great idea. He was facing the biophysical constraint of not actually having AC in his car. And so what he did was, if you'll remember some of the older style cars that had the vent windows on the front and they allowed a gentle airflow to come inside, he was always disturbed he wasn't getting enough air, so he actually got his welder out and he inverted those so that the airstream started to really come in fast and furious. And so it was a good, I think, response to a biophysical constraint. But the problem, as he told me about a week later, was, Philip, if you've never seen a woman get hit by a bumblebee at 60 miles an hour in the chest, you don't know pain. And so it was an interesting example of trying to actually deal with the biophysical constraints in perhaps not exactly the best way. So we have to be cautious about the potential outcomes of our decisions here. So we're going to dive in with the panel, and it's a great panel that we have here with us today. The ground rules are pretty simple. It's 15 minutes each, and there'll be a timekeeper. It's sitting right there in front of me here. And as we go forward here, I can tell you that this is also the 4th thing that I love about UVM, and that's the value of discourse. So we've saved half an hour for questions to any one or all of the panelists. And I'd ask that you write those questions down and save those for the end, if you would, please. And remember, it's still 5 o'clock nowhere. You're on Green Mountain time, so hang in there with us. So our first presenter that we have with us today is Eric Garza from the University of Vermont. The title of his presentation is The Energy Basis of Food Security. Eric Garza lectures at the University of Vermont here, teaching a range of food systems courses, including complexity in food systems and the real cost of food, the latter of which applies life cycle assessment methods to study the energy, environmental, and social cost associated with food production. He also leads the Burlington chapter of the Weston A. Price Foundation, serves on the UVM Food Systems Initiative Steering Committee and the Farm to Plate Initiative's Energy Cross-Cutting Team, and he also volunteers for various nonprofit nonprofits that support sustainable food production. He blogs at howeric.lives.com, and now you get to hear howerichthinks.net. Welcome, Eric.
Okay, energy basis of food security. So we had a great opportunity to listen to Ms. Naylor talk a little bit about energy in her keynote a little bit ago. I'm also going to be talking about energy, but I'm going to be talking about energy from a little bit of a different track. I approach this a little bit differently. What I'm going to start with in my talk here this afternoon is I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction in how I think of energy use in food systems. And then I'll go on to talk about the energy intensity of food and tie that into the idea of food security. So one of the ways that I look at energy use in food systems is through the return on investment framework. The return on investment framework, for those of you who study biofuels, is something that people will apply to biofuel production processes so they get a sense for how much energy you have to put into that production system versus how much energy in fuel you get back. I've done some work in biofuels. I've done some work in particularly biodiesel production here in Vermont as part of my doctoral dissertation. But nowadays, a lot of times I apply this way of thinking to food systems. So return on investment has us looking at the outputs of a system versus the inputs. The output of food systems is going to be food, the calories of energy that we get as food. There are two types of input energies that I look at. One of those is direct energy, which includes things like diesel that's used to power tractors, gasoline that's used in delivery vehicles, electricity that's used to power different types of machinery or different types of equipment. And also indirect energy, which is the energy that's used to manufacture and maintain and distribute the different types of machinery, vehicles, and inputs and other infrastructure that are used within food systems and that make it possible for that food system or any kind of system to deliver the goods. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be looking at is really the energy intensity of food systems, the return on investment from an energy standpoint that food systems can provide, and looking at that as this output over input model. Now, when we study biofuels like biodiesel, kind of the holy grail of a biofuel system is that you get back more energy in terms of the heat value of that fuel than you had to put into that system as fossil fuels or other fuels. So that you end up with a positive return on investment. Unfortunately, with our food system, we can't achieve that right now. What we do is we put a lot of energy into food systems, energy from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, to a lesser degree, energy from nuclear and other renewable fuels. And we get a little bit of food back. And so rather than looking at output over input and ending up talking about really small decimal numbers, I actually will present most of the data that I give you today as input over output so that we end up with a nice whole number that's easy for people to think about. So let's dive in and talk about energy use in the US food system. I think a lot of people have probably heard at some point a statistic that it takes 10 or 12 or whatever units of energy to deliver a calorie of food in the US. That was probably true at some point in the past. This data looks at 2002 figures that are derived from data that's offered through the US Department of Agriculture, trying to articulate how energy is used within the US food system. I'm not going to go into all of this in detail. If people are interested in talking about this, they can ask questions during the Q&A session. But this data is from 2002, and in 2002, it took about 12 units of energy inputs into the US food system to deliver a calorie of food that someone actually eats. So this is 12 units of input to deliver a calorie of food once we've corrected for wastage and spoilage. And as many people here know, in the United States, we typically waste around 40% of the food that ends up being produced. So in 1997, the figure was down around 11 calories of energy in for each calorie of food. 2002 went up to about 12 calories in for every calorie of food. By 2007, and I didn't present the 2007 data because it's not as disaggregated as the 2002 data is. In 2007, we were up to about 14 calories in for every calorie of consumed food. So you see an upward trend happening. And I didn't put a graph of this because it's just as easy to talk about. But the US food system is becoming progressively more energy intensive. We have to invest more and more energy to get a calorie of food that's actually eaten back. And that has some pretty big consequences in the context of food security, and I'll kind of lead us towards that by talking about corn. When you meet a lot of farmers and ask them about the cost of energy, a lot of farmers aren't necessarily thinking of the total cost of energy. What they're thinking of is the cost of direct energy. They're thinking about the amount of money they spend on diesel, the amount of energy they spend on electricity, amount of money they spend on gasoline. The direct energy component, and all of those are direct energy components, is oftentimes a very small component of the total energy cost of operating a farm or of operating any kind of food enterprise. I was able to get really good data on the cost of production for corn, so I'm making an example of corn to illustrate this. The really bold blue that you see on the screen up here, the very bottom bar, is the cost of energy as a function of the total cost of production for corn in the United States in the year 2012. So that's the direct component of energy use. If we look at the indirect component of energy in the cost of production of corn, it's actually quite a bit larger than that. And the indirect energy is the cost of the energy that went into manufacturing the tractor, the cost of the energy that went into manufacturing the building materials, the cost of energy that went into manufacturing and delivering the fertilizer, the pesticides. All these different ways that energy indirectly supports the operation of this farm, if you add up those costs, those dollar costs, and separate them out from all the other costs, like the cost of labor, the direct costs of capital, etc., then we see that the total cost of energy is going to be something around 30 to maybe 35% of the total cost of production of corn. Now that 35% isn't 50%, it's not 75%, it's not 95%. It's not an overwhelming majority of the cost of production of corn, but it's big enough that when we see the price of energy moving on a large scale for whatever reason, fossil fuel depletion, political challenges in oil-producing regions, the changing or rising cost of energy can have a pretty strong exert pretty strong upwards pressure on the cost of production for some of these different commodity crops and foods more generally. And so kind of the takeaway graph that I hope to show you here is this last graph where we look at energy prices over the last decade and a half, actually a couple decades, and food prices. Earlier on, I mentioned that in the United States, it takes a lot of energy to produce food, very energy-intensive endeavor. I also showed you how the cost of energy can be a meaningful share of the cost of food. So when we see energy prices spike, as we certainly have, or at least increase since 2000, along with the occasional price spikes in between, we see the cost of food not perfectly mirroring the trends in the price of energy, but we see them largely mirroring those trends. They followed each other very, very well. When we see the spike in prices that we saw with the oil shocks back around 2007, 2008, we saw a similar jump in the price of food because that energy is the cost of production in food. It's a meaningful share, so it's going to drive that cost of production up. So the idea behind my title of the energy basis of food security is just acknowledging that our food system is really energy intensive. And we're also acknowledging that a lot of people depend on markets to be able to access food, depending on their ability to purchase food. So as long as we have food systems that are so energy intensive, and as long as our food systems rely on energy sources that are overwhelmingly non-renewable and subject to depletion, things like oil, which is now trading in the $95 to $100 per barrel range, we are really making it challenging for us to deliver food security around the world because of how closely the price of food is going to track the price of fuel. So, one of my takeaway points then is when we think about food security, I really want people to think about think that energy is one of the big drivers of this food security. And if we want to be able to control the price of food, we need to look at the energy intensity of our food system and make meaningful investments in figuring out how we're going to start reducing that. I'm not going to go into huge details about how we can do that. Maybe we can do that in the Q&A session because it can be different for different types of farms, different in different parts of the world. But that's kind of the big takeaway point that I'd like to leave folks with. And if people have questions that are not addressed in the Q&A session afterwards, you can feel free to shoot me an email. And Philip mentioned the website that I have where I have a number of different articles that I've posted that look at some of the energy side of the food system in a lot more detail. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Philip, and we can move on to the next presenter. Thank you very much.